Saddam Hussein was born on April 28, 1937 in the village of Al-Awja near Tikrit, Iraq. Rose from humble beginnings to become one of the most prominent and controversial figures in Middle Eastern history.
Figures in history.
His life and political career were marked by ambition, ruthlessness, and the pursuit of power at any cost. Hussein's early years were shaped by hardship and political upheaval. Orphaned at a young age, he grew up in the care of his uncle and eventually joined the Iraqi Ba'ath Party in the late 1950s, a political party advocating for Arab nationalism and socialism. In 1968, Hussein played a key role in the Ba'ath Party's coup d'etat, which toppled the government and brought the party to power in Iraq. Over the next decade, he consolidated his authority within the party and the country, using brutal tactics to suppress dissent and eliminate rivals. And by the late 1970s, Hussein had assumed the presidency of Iraq, tightening his grip on power. As president, Hussein pursued an aggressive and expansionist foreign policy, leading Iraq into a long and devastating war with Iran in 1980. The conflict, which lasted for 8 years, resulted in hundreds of thousands of casualties and left both countries economically and socially devastated. But despite the human cost, Hussein's regime remained defiant, relying on a combination of military force and propaganda to maintain control. Hussein's rule was characterized by authoritarianism, state-sponsored violence, and the suppression of political opposition. His regime's use of chemical weapons against both Iranian forces and Iraqi Kurdish civilians, respectively during the Iran-Iraq War and the Anfal campaign in the late 1980s, remains a dark chapter in modern history, resulting in widespread condemnation and calls for international intervention. Internationally, Hussein's regime became increasingly isolated, particularly following Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990. Despite initial military successes, Iraq was decisively defeated and Hussein's forces were driven out of Kuwait by a coalition of US-led forces. In the aftermath of the Gulf War, Hussein's regime faced significant challenges, including economic sanctions, internal dissent, and international pressure to disarm. However, Hussein managed to cling to power through a combination of political maneuvering and suppression of his opposition. His regime's brutality and human rights abuses continued unabated. In 2003, the United States, citing falsified reports of weapons of mass destruction and ties to terrorism, launched a military invasion of Iraq. The invasion and subsequent occupation plunged Iraq into chaos, with thousands of Iraqis killed during the invasion and the years that followed, not to mention the looting of cultural artifacts and Iraqi oil. US forces are still present in Iraq, yet under a different mandate. Hussein was captured by coalition forces later in 2003, and in 2006, he was tried by an Iraqi court and sentenced to death for crimes against humanity. He was executed by hanging on December 30th, 2006, bringing an end to his brutal regime, yet only after the US turned Iraq into a ground of violence, instability, and suffering that continues to reverberate in the Middle East to this very day.